I feel like we've been saying in this last week when we've been installing the exhibition here that your practice, Candice, is difficult to encapsulate in a few words, and it resists kind of a straightforward interpretation. So it's hard to figure out where we begin. But I thought maybe we should talk about kind of the origins of the idea for the installation here. And it's an exhibition that we've been working on for well over a year, and it was delayed, of course, due to the pandemic. But I don't know, Candice and Dan, can I ask you both to kind of start off on kind of how the ideas came together for the installation?
Well, I mean, it's a funny question because I feel like this is, in this kind of curator-artist relationship, really Candice did all the work here, so we should be clear about that. But I guess we did, I mean, you and I each did studio visits with Candice separated by about a month, and I think we were each drawn to sort of things that seemed to be pushed to the side of the studio, and maybe things that you weren't necessarily sharing with us and would just say, oh yeah, this is something I do for myself, or this is a test for something. And I think, we were intrigued by some of those objects and the status that they had in the studio and the status they had for you. And so that was sort of where I think our conversations began, of asking you to maybe lean into that work rather than starting from a kind of research premise, which is maybe where a lot of your other major projects have begun. Is that a fair recollection, or?
Yeah, we already established in this week that I have a very bad memory, so I might remember things wrong. But what I remember is that I was coming up with some ideas that were an extension of my more material, where I'll pick a certain material and research it, and that kind of becomes a framework for the stuff I'm making. So I had some initial ideas around that, and then when you guys did the studio visit, you'd be like, what's this? And I'd be like, oh, that's just my rotting rat with flesh-eating beetles, and oh, that's just my Roger painting that no one's supposed to look at. And then, of course, you guys are going and
Roger's Candice's cat.
Flipping over things, and I thought it established Roger early.
Yeah, early.
So, and I heard that's a curator thing, to go and find the thing that's hidden in the corner that you're not supposed to look at.
Poke around, yeah.
I mean, that's the privilege of the studio visit. And I will say in the catalog, which hopefully you can pick up here soon, there are some good images of Candice's studio and the things in there, so you can get a peek into that. But all this happened right before COVID. And so maybe it was a good moment to be thinking about what was at hand. And I don't know, I feel like the journal that's behind us there is maybe one place to kind of start with some of the imagery and themes. Is that the kind of generating thing for the installation, or how did it begin for you?
Yeah, I started making, I don't know if everybody had a chance to look at the journal, but it started out as more of a sketchbook of material processes. So Vicky wrote an essay about old 19th century textile scrapbooks for her undergrad thesis.
This is about 15 years ago. So.
And it was really interesting. And so I was thinking a lot about how these textile, kind of 19th century textile scrapbooks also recorded personal family histories, but also how global shifts in trade of materials and how textiles were produced, and the patterns that were on some of the fragments of fabric scraps were kind of inadvertently recorded as well in those journals. And so I wanted my journal to be a note-taking of the processes I was using to make the fabrics and some of the tests. But it became more also as the year and a half unfolded and was so particular, as we all know. It couldn't help but become also an object that kind of witnesses along with everything that was happening.
Mm-hmm. And the title of the journal is a journal of the plague year, pandemic journal. And so if you have time after this Oh, sorry, Cat Demon Diary, yes. And if you have time after this to really flip through it, I mean, it's such, I think, a generous offering on the part of Candice to get a little bit of a glimpse inside of kind of, you know, as she was saying, her research processes and what she was thinking as she was making the work. But one thing, you know, you talked about kind of the material processes that are encapsulated in the book through the fabric scraps. And of course, you know, right behind us, we really see these indigo textile panels that was one of the, I think, early material processes that you mentioned that you were really interested in actually engaging with from the get-go. So can you maybe talk a little bit about indigo and how you came to indigo maybe from other materials that you had been exploring earlier in your practice, and maybe a little bit about how you actually made the works, the textiles?
Yeah, so in 2015 and 16, I got interested in like the way that Lisa Lowe was writing about dyeing of fabrics in her book, The Intimacies of Four Continents. And from that, I started researching cochineal, the insect that was used to make red dye and is still used. And I was interested in indigo's history at the time. I was also looking at the overlapping connections with other colonial commodities like sugar and opium poppies and tea, porcelain, probably some other things I'm forgetting. But indigo, when I started to like think about it, it was like, I could tell it was too big of a subject to bring into that mix. So it was always in my mind as something I wanted to research further. I actually met somebody at one of my openings about something else, and he was like, why aren't you making work about indigo? And I was like, I will, I think. So I can't remember your name, but here it is. Our conversation is still in my mind. Yeah.
I'm kind of curious about, I mean, there's probably more to say about how you made the textiles, but also I feel like the thing that's staring us in the face are these three cats, and I think we probably can't go further in talking about this installation without talking about cats.
Mm-hmm. I'm ready for talking about cats. Yeah.
That's my softball to you. Yeah. The rest of the conversation will be in cat, but I mean, it seems, and your essay, I mean, it's a lot about cats. So I feel like I don't. Yeah.
What shall we talk about cats? Cats are such a good subject. It's a very broad subject.
Maybe you could start with the cats in this installation.
And the cats in your life.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really have that much to say about it. They're just like, cats are present. Be more specific, maybe.
Well, I mean, I think, you know, we were, over the year, we were talking about kind of cats and kind of their tactile form of thinking, or you would, you know, observe your cat Roger and how he would maybe recognize something, but it wasn't really visual, it was more tactile. And that seems to have really kind of seeped into an experience of the installation.
So I would say, yeah, like maybe to think about that way of knowing through tactility, and also maybe a more specific question around cats is, you spent the pandemic year with your cat, and that was an intense and important relationship that is conveyed in this installation, and also the cats in your neighborhood and the worlds that they brought into contact with your home and your life, and maybe you could sort of talk about that set of relationships.
Okay, that helps. Yeah, so the animation that's in the tent is the story of White and Gray, who was a feral cat that lived on my porch for 11 years. Roger is my cat that I live with, and a lot of this work was made outside in my yard during the pandemic, and I have a lot of images of Roger kind of walking on the rugs that were just out there and hanging out. The cat pillows that are in the tent that people are invited to take and rest on are also thinking about this kind of like interspecies presence of cats in my life during this time period, but they also reference it's actually, the inspiration comes from this one specific ceramic cat pillow from the Tang Dynasty that was in some ways racialized and associated with like opium dens and people being identified through addiction through the shape of their swollen ears from resting on hard pillows. So there's like, there's cats, and like the work is like easy to talk about as cats, but there are also lots of other references. I was thinking about Mel Weichen's work around toxicity and intoxication and how those things are kind of racialized and intertwined. So that's another thread in the work. There's this cat, this qigong cat. I don't know if it's a cat, maybe it's not a cat, demon, pig creature.
Which visitors are, when we have these chairs cleared, you see cat paw prints on the ground. So we're encouraging visitors to take a stand at one of those cat paw prints and follow along with the qigong exercises. But yeah, I mean, I think also, you know, what you touched on, Candice, about kind of thinking about different interspecies kind of relationalities, super interesting, and kind of the human and non-human, you know, forces in this exhibition. I mean, it really is one, if you take a look at around the installation, I mean, human beings are somewhat deprioritized in a way that you don't see too frequently in, you know, other exhibitions. So really curious to hear you maybe tease apart a little bit more kind of that different understanding of different relationalities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, a lot of it I feel like when I was making it just comes from a very intuitive place. Like I just, like these kind of human-animal hybrid forms just come out of my imagination since I was a child. But I think thinking about it after the fact, I think I was thinking about how a lot of the patterns referenced in the textiles have to do with these historical textiles, some of which are ones that come out of moments of global trade or colonialism. There are Adire textiles that come from Nigeria, and during British occupation, like changed in style and symbols, and then changed in a different way after independence. There are Japanese karazome textiles that have influence from Portuguese and Dutch, forget what they're called, like the corporate business logos of the time for the trade companies, where those graphic letter forms become used more as images that don't have language-based meaning. And so I think that the hybrid human animal imagery maybe is related to this idea of like this kind of imagery that comes from being between things, or imagery that like blurs these kind of categories or distinctions of origin or of species.
Without like trying to make every aspect of this work about this COVID year, is there a relationship between the sort of specific questions around public health and animals and humans this year that came into the work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, for sure, there's images of bats and things that could be civets, I don't know. There's definitely a presence of that, thinking about that. I mean, a lot of my work before this work was explicitly about thinking about histories of hygiene and racialization of disease, and so yes, that's present.
Yeah, and in some ways, I feel like we've been saying that this is a work that could have only been made during this pandemic year. I mean, I don't know if that's, you know, that may be too much of a statement, but I mean, this year was really one where, as you said, you were kind of confined, you know, to your home studio, making all of these works, you know, both inside and then in your backyard. But you know, I think there's so many other influences, like the cat video, you know, doing these qigong movements. You were saying that, you know, this was kind of an exercise or routine that your parents were trying to get you to do to kind of stretch. And I think all of us can probably relate to that
all
when
those
we were
Zoom
at
hours.
home. Yeah, exactly.
Especially for teachers.
For long hours of sitting. But yeah, I think, you know, there's very much a lot of the pandemic, kind of this, you know, especially once you watch the video, it has kind of this post-apocalyptic scenario that seems to unfold. And we talked about how, you know, of course there's the pandemic, but there was also in California those catastrophic wildfires and you were outdoors making a lot of this work. So in some ways it seemed like this was like your kind of, you know, imagining for what a present or a future could look like if, human beings who may have caused a lot of this destruction were not right at the center of all of our inquiry. So it was interesting for, I think, me and Dan to kind of, again, we were very much, on the sidelines watching via Zoom as you were making all this work. But it was just interesting to see how the work evolved over the year and how so much of, collectively what people were feeling seemed to be embedded in the making in a super interesting way.
Do you feel like this project, more than others, had a kind of back and forth between the world and the project? Is that maybe we're all just in this kind of self-aware moment, but I also just think back to the journal where there's images and reflections from the news, from sort of our common social experience that then seems to have had a sort of ongoing back and forth with the way the project developed.
Yeah, I feel like it's still weird for me because I feel like this project is more intuitive and more personal and more of this direct relationship rather than a more distant subject that I'm researching and making work about. Yeah.
Well, you've said, that you felt like this exhibition in a way was like a shift for you in your practice or kind of a turning point of sorts. And would you say it's because you were working from this intuitive, tactile place first, as opposed, and of course there's so much, history and the research that you've done in the past is embedded in this. But is that kind of how you see the shift, that you were starting from there as opposed to the really, heavy research in the idea generation?
Yeah, I feel like usually I have some conscious ideas around why I'm making the choices I'm making, and a lot of this wasn't in that realm. So it feels kind of vulnerable and I feel unsure still about how to present it. Because as much as I love cats, I also don't want this just to be a cat show, but it's also hard to talk about all the other things that it's about.
I think it's interesting though how whether it's cats or other aspects of this become avatars or symbols for other sets of relationships. And the kinds of narratives that the cats are speaking in this work are dark, they're literate, they're sort of the world, and it may be this thing that is close to you and that you're intimate with, but that then becomes a kind of mouthpiece for larger ideas. Also, this was a year of intimacy and vulnerability, I think, for a lot of people, and that's one of the ways I think this work resonates, with this moment. I'm also just thinking about the labor that went into it. I think we were very aware from the sort of curatorial perspective how much work you were doing, and that may be a sort of obvious thing to say, artists make work, it takes labor, but there's something about the range of materials and also just the time that a lot of these procedures take. Is this sort of in line with how you work, or can you say something about the kind of
I feel like
labor
this was definitely the longest I've had to work on a single installation, and I was, as everything got postponed and shuffled around, I was grateful for that extra time. It was also, I think, my first time working in this scale with textiles, and there was something around so the way I make these textiles is with a process called karazome or tsutsugaki, where you take a glutinous rice powder and rice bran and you steam it in little dumplings for 2 to 6 hours, and then you grind it up, and then you squeeze it out of a squeeze bottle or a pastry bag to make the drawings. Or I also cut a lot of these stencils by hand with the help of my assistant Joel Freeman, and then the way that they're applied is not fast. And there was, after I was finished, and it took so long to make all these textiles, I had this moment of disappointment because there's we wear clothes, we're surrounded by textiles that are mostly digitally printed. And so there was this feeling of does this translate, this labor? So actually you sent me, I think, a text that was something about the labor, and I was okay, good.
It looks like a lot of work, don't worry, yeah. But I'm curious about that slowness. So for the imagery on the textiles, did you have sketches and plans, or were you sort of responding to the speed of the application of that to come up with the imagery?
I had some loose sketches, more compositional, and then I would draw whatever kind of came. Yeah. I was trying at a certain point, I was like, okay, no more genitals, no more these guys. I don't know, there's like certain things that just come up again and again, and I felt like I got a little bit in a default rut.
Can you talk a little bit also just about indigo and like how do you make the indigo vat? I mean, that too is there's so much effort going into just making the dye that you don't see beyond once it's dyed.
Yeah, and that connects to the title. So as Jackie was saying, the fermenting, the bacteria that is actually present in the process of making indigo dyeing, there's a lot of different kinds of vats you can create. And so a lot of my processes early on were trying out different vats with like moldy fruit, boiling moldy fruit, and peeing in a bucket, and then there's like other kind of less fermented versions of indigo that you can use. But I was interested in the way that indigo was like talked about as a medicinal plant-based material, as well as this like kind of colonial and slave production in indigo's history. And also the ingestion of indigo, like when workers were kind of submerged in what was called the devil's tank, and were like kind of finding ways to like deal with the way that the indigo was absorbed into the body. So yeah, I dyed these panels in a big kiddie pool, which white and gray must have fallen in because I saw him later. He was a white and gray cat, as his name indicates, and he had blue paws in some of his last days. Yeah.
Not to be confused with gray and white.
Yes, Tarmactoon.
Yeah.
And there's also some
maybe Roger's father.
Great language that you've shared around like indigo and like the baby and the bed covers. I can't remember exactly what
I can't remember either, but yeah, there's like when you make so there's two steps of fermentation. One is like when you take the green indigo leaves and you ferment it under straw mats or like just heaping it up so that it starts to break itself down and create the bacteria that will aerate and reduce the vat. It's called the straw mats, I think in Japan are called the bed covers, and if like it doesn't ferment properly, they say the baby is angry or sulky. And so there's this like, and then you have to give sake to the baby. You just drink some more alcohol, you'll be fine. To try to like placate and make the indigo behave. So there's like these kind of funny familial roles or something.
Could you talk about the ceramics? If we can go from fabric to, and where the imagery comes from.
Oh yeah. So some of them kind of reference these Zamushu tomb demons that are often these animal, human, demon figures stomping on other animals, and were placed in the entrances of tombs to protect the spirits of the dead. The central figure with the multiple faces is also a reference to this image of a devil that this guy, George Salazar, drew. He was in the early 18th century. He was a European, probably from France, who pretended to be from Formosa, present-day Taiwan. And he wrote a whole elaborate ethnography. And one part of the ethnography was this image of this devil that baby boys were sacrificed to, supposedly. And so I was, I mean, a lot of this wasn't conscious, but I was thinking about it later, and I was like, okay, I think the reason I was interested in his iconography in relationship to what I was saying earlier about these indigo textiles that have these kind of cross-cultural moments is that like there's a aspect of translation or mistranslation around perceived like difference in culture and like the allure of that, but also like maybe the exotification of that and like what happens in the making of imagery when those, when people come together, I don't know. Not in a celebratory way, necessarily, I don't know.
Right. And it's interesting when you look at the ceramic figures up close. I mean, they're made in different parts, and I think that also, I mean, it emphasizes that, you were making this again, like in your backyard. And I think you were saying that, had you been able to utilize the kiln at UCLA where you teach, they probably would have been maybe in 2 parts, or some of them could have been whole. But this is kind of what fit into your home kiln. But I love that they're modular, and actually we should say that every aspect of the exhibition is modular, right? So Candice, do you want to talk about the panels? They can be hung kind of in a banner-like fashion. They can be a structure, but they also have another.
Yeah, they are
form.
also designed to be clothing. So the holes function both as like windows to view the video out of the tent, but also like as neck holes, so that you could wear this as like a head to foot dress, or there's the shorter ones in the front are like tunics.
Yeah, and they all kind of clip together, so it's fairly easy to clip on, clip off, though we probably won't be doing it during the run of the exhibition.
No fashion show.
Yeah.
And the figures in the video are from your ceramics, right? So these are animating ceramics?
Yeah,
Is that a fair way to describe it?
Well, I made a small model. I made the character out of ceramic, and then Yotam Mendelevi helped me scan one of the cat demon figure and animate it in Cinema 4D. And the memes that kind of pop up also were very much of the time. I was, like many of us, installing work from afar during the pandemic. So I was installing my show at Pigs and Poison in the Times Museum. And I don't know if this is just particular to the Times Museum, but we had a very good group chat going on. Do you know this? Where they would send me all these questions, and usually it would be like overnight while I was sleeping, and then they wouldn't get any response from me, and then they would start sending all these cat memes. So I would wake up and I would look at my phone and it'd be like 12 cat memes, and I'd be like, oh, this is so great. And then they'd be like, oh yeah, like, can you reply to our question? So a lot of those memes ended up in here. That one was in there.
So once Candice actually told us this, we started really pushing the cat memes and then slipping questions in.
If we could, there has to be some way to archive group texts for, museum archives. I'm not sure what that is yet, but it's pretty good.
Yeah, we were saying, well, you said Candice has, many late night ideas, because we were in 3 different time zones. Dan is, 3 hours ahead of the West Coast. I'm 2 hours, so at a certain point.
Bad artist boundaries.
No, it's good. It's wake up to, an image of a severed mouse head is a nice way to be greeted in the morning.
Should we, do you want to talk a little bit about the tactile theaters that are back there?
The tactile theaters are meant to be, people sit on either side and kind of like feel them while looking at each other. And one of them, the concrete one, comes out of my site visit to the Carpenter Center, which was designed by Corbusier, who I don't know anything about.
You like concrete, that's something.
He liked concrete, he was a modernist. And so that one I titled Tactile Theater after Noguchi, and I was thinking about Noguchi's models for playgrounds and different models for the body and kind of like natural space, particularly during his time in being at first voluntarily interred. So thinking about these like other types of periods of time of interment and like confinement, like what we went through, but different, very different. And the other one is after Jan Svankmajer, who was a Czech artist and animator, and it's made out of scagliola, which is like kind of a pigmented plaster. And they're both like ways of thinking about surrogates of like the body, like a mediated body that maybe eases us into touching each other's bodies with an object in between.
Yeah, I feel like they're kind of like a key or an index to the show in a lot of ways, where it organizes touch as this social thing and way to know art. I mean, a lot of this installation can be touched, which is different than some, and I think that feels like a really important experience within it.
Hopefully it won't be a super spreader.
Yeah, here's hoping. Also, I like the idea that you think that people are going to look at each other as they touch it, or like look away. I don't know, it's an interesting...
Yeah.
It's like playing footsie under the table or something, but...
Yeah, I mean, sometimes your hands kind of meet in the center. But I mean, as you were saying, I just want to emphasize, Dan, that it's so rare, in museums. I mean, we're always saying, don't touch, please don't touch. And here it's really, please do touch. And really for the tactile theaters, I mean, you have to touch them to experience them. And I love that it's prioritizing, again, the haptic sense over the visual. So that feels super
Not that
special.
there's any poverty of visual information either, but there's just a lot of senses that can be.
Yeah. Yeah, so maybe we'll open it up to questions. I think we have maybe about 15 minutes, 10 to 15 minutes. So yeah, if anyone has questions for Candice about this installation, specific aspects of it.
I feel like it felt weird because it's pretty intimate to be pretending we're on some distant, I don't know, it felt, I kept wanting to be blah, 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 talking to people here. Yeah, so.
Or meow.
So we're all going to get into the tent now? Is that?
Yeah, we can get in the tent, we can meow at each other.
Yeah, and if there are any questions, I can help. Amplify, yes, thank you for the word. Repeat and amplify. But maybe while we wait, we'll give people a little bit of time. Oh, we have, okay, yeah.
Back to your question about, or your topic about labor, I'm curious if there was a lot of trial and error as you were working on the textile element. There's such a precision to the mark making and then stenciling and everything else. I'm just curious how the process evolved. Were you learning as you went?
Yeah.
I'm just going to repeat the question real quick, so just so that we have it recorded. But the question was about labor and if there was trial and error as you were making a lot of the works. Sorry, that didn't encapsulate the question as well as you asked it.
That's a great question. Yes, and there were a lot of processes I tried and didn't end up using. So there's a iron tannin dyeing process. There's a mordant with cochineal in the Indigo that was taken from me learning about how chintz was made. That is in the journal as a sample, but I didn't end up including it, partly because I just visually thought it was kind of a lot. I mean, there's a lot going on. I was like, oh, if there were more colors, maybe that's too much. And then a lot of my different experiments with the indigo vats were very smelly and temperamental, and the baby was sulky, and I gave it alcohol and it was still sulky, and then I peed on it, and it was, there was a lot of, there were a lot of things you don't see where it didn't work very well. Also, I had a rat infestation in my studio, so these last panels, which show images of rats being stewed and rats being picked up and maybe about to be eaten. The rats came in and they were really upset about that, and they somehow got up onto this table that's this high, and they carefully ate the rice paste off of it. They left a couple holes. So then I redid it and I tacked it to the wall, and they somehow scaled the wall because I came back and they had eaten the rest of it. So then I wrote them a letter in rice paste that's kind of psycho, and I left it there as a message, and then I took these home and finished them, and then they didn't care. They totally ate the whole message. Yeah.
Other questions?
Any other questions?
So you were talking about fermentation and rotting, and I'm wondering if you considered the clay fermentation and rotting as part of this process, or if that's something that you explored at all.
So the question is about fermentation and rotting as it relates to the indigo, but also perhaps clay.
That's an interesting question. I have been thinking about the site of some specific clays I'm using for a different project. This clay was more just, I happened to have a giant stack of this one red sculpture clay, and it was going to be hard to get more during the pandemic, so I just kind of was using the clay that I had. I do think whenever I think about ceramics, I am thinking a lot about time, the sedimentation process. I mean, maybe you know more about this than I do. I feel a little self-conscious talking about it in front of you. You'll be like, that's not quite right. But yeah, I do think about how ceramics last for a really long time, but also that the way that clay is made is like this kind of decomposition of rock over time, and like I feel like the kind of barrenness of the landscape in the video does bear a relationship to the geological processes that make clay. But I wasn't thinking about it specifically with fermentation, but I am working with this clay that comes out of swamps in Louisiana for my Prospect 5 project, where I am. There is some more fermented mud clay relations going on there.
Also, for your previous installation, A Hard White Body, I mean, you were playing with clay. I don't know, do you want to talk about that just really briefly?
In that work, there was a lot of porcelain that was unfired bedroom that was kept wet with distilled piss from visitors and people that worked in the gallery. And over time, it grew moss and mushrooms and cracked and got smelly. Smelled wonderful.
I think there was one more question.
Yeah, I was just curious about the, like how you reach the idea of it being tent, because textile can turn into so many different things as a launch point. So why a tent and sort of why create the architecture within a gallery as the form of the installation?
That's a great question. So the question is about why the tent, and yeah, I'll leave it at there.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer for that. I mean, I was thinking about spaces of rest and play, and so like, you know, there is this feeling of like the childhood when you pull out the sheets and you make your like pillow tent fort kind of feeling. But actually, it's interesting because one of the tent things I was looking at that where there's these clothing things that become tents was actually a military tent. And Indigo also has this very fraught history with like military and uniforms, and so there are these like other kinds of ways you could read it. But I think I was mostly thinking about it as an intimate space of rest, and that like being surrounded in this kind of like soft fabric would change how you experience it, I hope.
And I think there's, I mean, this is, you know, we wrote our essays about this project before it was done, and I mean, one speculative thought I had about that structure was also just the modularity, and like it's something that could exist, could be picked up and transported somewhere else, and sort of this special place outside of the world can be transported elsewhere. But yeah, being inside of it, definitely there is some relationship to like temple, tomb, encampment, all these associations. Yeah,
and I think maybe also like the kind of nomadicness, like relating to what he said about the imagery kind of coming from a long span of time and a mixing of cultural contact and a circulation of people and goods and viruses and beings. Yeah.
Should we take one final question?
Thank you so much. So the question is, I wonder if you could speak a little bit more about maybe the affective or emotional impact of engaging with the images that you include or the processes. So when you're talking about interspecies relationalities, right, what is kind of like the feeling, joy, comfort, or maybe frustration? You could elaborate a little bit more about what that relationship has been like over the years.
So the question is, sorry, I'm having a hard time encapsulating that. Kind of the relationship to, I guess, the imagery that you've created in like an affective or emotional way.
Around the interspecies.
Yeah.
Interspecies, yeah. So around the same time I was making this work, I was also making paintings of Roger that were not meant to be seen. And I think for both of those, they were like those were being painted out of the leftover paint of my more serious paintings. And I think for both of those, it's like a very tender, maybe that's why it feels vulnerable and like I feel self-conscious about it. But like they come out of a tender place of like, you know, you're drawing your beloved, so you feel a certain way about that. And then a lot of the imagery that I feel like maybe looks more monstrous or grotesque to other people just looks like really like my normal inner landscape. And so like, I think because like, it was funny, I was outside and somebody came by and was like, my neighbor was like scared by how the figures looked. They were like, oh, you have a lot of like creepy stuff. Like, is that for Halloween? And I was like, oh no, that's just my art. And then another time I saw somebody go by and one of these guys was out kind of in my driveway and they like patted it without realizing that I was watching them. So there's also like, I like that it transfers both like maybe different kinds of a range of emotions to other people too. But yeah, I mean, I made stuff that like, I think comes from a place of love and things that feel tender and real, and I don't know. Yeah.
Well, let's do one final question, then we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
It's a question for you all. Can you talk more about the collaboration and actually between the three of you, but also how at the Carpenter this will take shape? What shape will have the tent, if there is?
We haven't really figured, we thought we would open this show first and then think about the next one, and there's some ranges of possibilities. As Candice mentioned, it's a building designed by Le Corbusier. It's the only building in North America, and there's some concrete references that we might play with, but we're gonna have that conversation. But in terms of I don't know if there's more you want to say on that.
I was just going to say that there's also a larger version of this tent, and so there are also some panels and rugs that aren't shown that were part of it.
And the rugs are amazing.
Yeah, and I mean, we were saying that all of this is modular and can be shown in different ways. So, the textile panels can be hung on the walls, rugs can be hung on the walls. So, it's super interesting. It'll be super interesting to see, what configuration it takes in a different institution.
It's such a pleasure to be able to install a show for a second time and kind of reimagine its components, especially when there are so many components that relate to each other in so many different ways. In terms of our collaboration, I feel like we had a lot of fun, and I think it's okay to admit to that, and I'm really happy that we did. I also feel like you just did all the work, and we were just there like being like, go Candice, like,
I mean, it was funny because Vicky and Dan have very different aesthetics, I think, because I'd be like, I'm so confused about which glaze to use. Should I use this glaze or this glaze? And then Vicky would be like, I love the muted glaze. And then Dan would be like, I like the really colorful one.
I think
like,
actually
great.
we consistently gave you
Always.
opposing.
It was like always it didn't help.
So it's probably more confusing of it.
But it's good, you got like a strong argument on either side of the...
And it didn't help my decision making.
I actually think you kind of managed to, do both ways. I mean, they're muted, yet they have, lots of color. And I mean, you definitely have, these really striking red tongues on a number of the sculptures.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was super, I mean, we were saying it was super interesting because of the pandemic, I mean, we weren't in the same space. We couldn't visit you couldn't come out here to do a site visit. And so all of this was happening via Zoom, via text message. And really when we saw the work here for the first time being installed was when we saw it in person for the first time. So it was really thrilling for us to be able to see the work in person that we had seen only via images or video. But I think it's super special when you can have institutional partnerships and really wonderful collaborators, and it felt like such a generous process all around. And I think we were just so happy to be kind of along for the ride and to see again kind of how the work was taking shape and evolving over this year.
And I think it's definitely like a great example of the kind of project that's like very much about a new commission where having two curators kind of being able to talk and hopefully offer more support or conflicting opinions, but where the curating really is about hopefully just like a open and supportive relationship to be able to get to work that's as ambitious as this and that's so speculative until we actually get to see it. So when you read the catalog and if there's some things in the essays that don't exactly ring true, you can be generous around that. But
always hard to make a catalog before the work's finished.
It's okay. It's a beautiful book. So
yeah. Well, maybe we'll end there, and I guess I'll just plug the book once more since we ended on that, but there are copies of the catalog in our shop. So yeah, please go down and grab one if you'd like to. And yeah, thanks to all of you for coming out for this conversation, and thanks again to Candice and Dan, and yeah, we welcome everyone to experience the work.
Get in the tent.